We are recording now. Well, my name's Cody Maxwell, Fannin County Extension Agent for Agriculture and Natural Resources, and this is our webinar. It's usually an annual program that we do, but due to the situations, it's a webinar this year on aquatic weed ID and controlling pond weeds. And so it's something that we've been getting a lot of phone calls on here over the last, I would say over the last couple of months for sure. But I think we could date these questions all the way back to probably December 2019. When we get in these situations when we're having a mild winter, such as we had this last year, whenever we get into a rainy spring, just like we had this last year in spring 2020, pond weeds are just they tend to rise up there to those top 5 questions that we get through our office. And again, I've been answering pond algae questions all the way dated back to December of 2019. It's just been algae's been a bad problem this whole year, not only for the summertime but spring and winter as well. But whenever we get questions about pond, we field a lot of questions concerning stocking ponds with the different types of species, recreational fish that we can stock these ponds with. We get a lot of questions about that, but our biggest question that we get pertaining to ponds is going to be pond weeds. Usually it's an issue because we all like to fish our ponds. We probably utilize them for many different reasons, one being livestock water and source. Some people may be utilizing them for irrigation. Many people, though, if they've got some fish in it, they're having fun with their family and kids or grandkids out there for sure. So whenever we look at pond weeds, the number one thing that we want to make sure and do is to get those weeds identified properly. Some of these pond weeds, whenever we get into a situation when somebody's explaining them over the phone, some of the pond weeds are described very much the same. Some of them are described as being very similar to one another. And so we want to make sure we get them identified properly. That could be done through talking with me, sending photos to me, or we have probably one of our best websites that we have within Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. I've loved this website ever since I've started my career with Extension. Aquaplant.tamu.edu. It's listed right there. You'll hear me reference it several times as we go through this webinar today. But first and foremost, we've got to have the proper identification. Once we get the proper identification, then we can formulate a plan of attack against those pond weeds. So to back up from a standpoint of okay, we have the weeds, let's back up just a little bit. If we want to prevent the weeds from establishing, there's a couple of things that we can do. Number one, which is probably easier said than done in many cases, is eliminate shallow water less than 2 feet deep. If you'll notice, whenever you go out to your ponds, much of your weed establishment begins right there at the water's edge. Right there at the bank is where your weed establishment is going to take place. From there, it will spread out over the whole surface area of the pond in many cases. So usually it takes heavy machinery equipment to eliminate these shallow areas. Again, it's a little easier said than done. However, it's definitely doable. We've worked with many clientele over the last several years that have gone in and done this with their ponds and really eliminated their issues that they had with pond weeds. You think of the time that we're in now, during the drought-like periods. Some people's been fortunate over the last month to get some rain. Maybe you were fortunate to get some rain yesterday. But there's been a lot of areas. Talked with some people on the phone this morning that they hadn't had any rain since June. And so it just kind of depends on where you're located at. depending on if you got rainfall or not. But if you're in those areas that have been experiencing some drought-like conditions, not getting any rainfall, those ponds tend to we lose a little water. They go down, evaporation of water, or if you've got livestock out there drinking on them, those ponds have become a little more shallower, so it allows you to get to those shallow areas, to get to the water's edge right there, or where it would be if it was bank full, and get in there and try to eliminate some of these areas that are less than 2 feet deep. Number 2 is you can initiate a spring fertilization program after your herbicide application. So if you have an early flux of weeds that may come in, and you get in there and you do some weed control on them, if you can do some spring fertilization, what that will do is that's going to help build up that phytoplankton within that pond. If we build up the phytoplankton, we can increase the amount of zooplankton in that pond, and then that's food source for our fish. If we can increase it up to a certain amount, it usually equivalates a pound of bass. And so spring fertilization programs are really do a really good job in these ponds, not only from a standpoint of creating some good things within our pond, but number 2, creating a food source. Not necessarily for our large fish in the pond, but some of those smaller fish, some of the bait fish, it's going to help them in their food source. So 2 things that we can do to try to eliminate those weeds or prevent the weed establishment. Tips for controlling aquatic weeds. You'll hear me stress this several times as we go throughout the webinar today, but identification is key. You gotta know the plant that you're dealing with. In some cases, some of these pond weeds may be a good thing for us, depending on what they are and depending on the severity of the coverage that we might have across those ponds with them. But first and foremost, we want to make sure that we know the plant. Once we understand the plant that we're dealing with, once we know what it is, then we can get the proper control options. And we'll talk about all those control options as we go through the webinar here in just a little bit. If you are going to be applying an aquatic herbicide, always want to read and make sure that you follow the label. There's a label there for a reason. It's been tested by the EPA. It's been tested by the State Department of Agriculture. That label's on there, or accepted by the State Department of Agriculture. So that label's on there for a reason. It's got mixing instructions. It's got weeds controlled on there. And so sometimes if we don't know the proper plant, or if we don't know what plant we're dealing with out there, and we just go buy an aquatic chemical, if that weed's not on the label, then it's not going to work on it. And then also too, if we don't apply that or mix it properly, if we're supposed to mix it, then the efficacy of the control won't be there. Apply herbicides during the growing season. I know it says right there late summer and early fall, or too late. We're getting into a time frame right now, and I wanted to do this program now because it's just been a big question that we've been experiencing over the last couple of weeks is pond weeds. So I wanted to talk about and help identify some of these things that we're dealing with, and if you're able to implement a control program this year, great. If not, at least give you some tools to be ready for whenever things do start coming out next spring. Problems whenever we get into fall, late summer, these hot days that we've been experiencing, and we're so thankful for the cooler weather that we got yesterday, and even though it's hot today, it's still cooler than what we had the last couple of weeks. But whenever we get into these times in late July, moving into August, September, early October, days become real still. Some days we'll get a good south breeze, but a lot of days the air is just stagnant. There's no air movement whatsoever. Humidity's high. So what happens in those ponds is we have a lack of oxygen. The oxygen will not be present in those ponds. And so what happens is we'll end up, it's termed oxygen depletion. And those will actually have fish die off from that. I actually had my first phone call of oxygen depletion this week back on Monday. And so So it has happened in some cases. So that's the one thing you want to be real careful with applying aquatic herbicides in the really, really hot days where there's no air movement whatsoever. You want to be real careful because we can actually cause oxygen depletion if we don't apply these chemicals correctly. And then to treat infections is key. It's going to tell you on that label, depending on the different types of aquatic herbicides. Some are going to say apply half of the chemical at a time over half of the pond. Some of them are going to say a third of the pond at a time. Some of them are going to say a quarter of the pond at a time. Then what you're going to have on that label is an application interval. So, for instance, if the application interval, and I'm just giving an example here. Remember, read and follow the label. Every label is different. But, for example, if it has an application interval of 14 days, you'll make that, if it says apply a third of the pond at a time, you'll make an application. 14 days later, make another application on the next third. 14 days later, make another application on the next third. That's going to help prevent oxygen depletion. So moving into probably what you're here for is to find out how to control these aquatic weeds. We break it down into three different sections, three different ways of controlling these aquatic weeds. We've got a biological control, mechanical control, and then a chemical. And we'll talk about all of these in depth. So first and foremost is your biological control, and this is done with triploid grass carp. Some of you may have triploid grass carp. Some of you may be exploring the options of triploid grass carp, but it is one of the options that we have available to us. The one thing about triploid grass carp, if you're going to apply them, you're going to have a permit to be able to stock them in your ponds or stock tanks. That permit is obtained from Texas Parks and Wildlife. That link right there. And if you don't get it wrote down in time, feel free to send me an email. I'll be happy to email this presentation out, and we'll also obviously have it recorded, and we'll put it on our YouTube channel for later viewing. But that's the link right there. Or if you just want to Google Texas Parks and Wildlife triploid grass carp application or permit, it'll pop up. So you'll have to apply to be able to get the permits to be able to make the purchase of the triploid grass carp is the process on how that works. If you're looking for long-term control on these ponds, it's a great way to go. I'll show you here in just a minute their food choice preferences that they have in ranking order. But if you've got some, for example, on the filamentous algae, we'll have algae blooms all throughout the year. And so if you're trying to get a hold on them algae blooms, if you're trying to control that algae as you start seeing it, if you just now go out there and put your triploid grass carp out there, the short-term effect is not going to be very good. It's whenever we're doing triploid grass carp, we're going for the long-term effects. So what some people will try to do is they may get the permit for the grass carp, they'll stock with the grass carp, and then for the short-term effect, they'll go ahead and utilize aquatic herbicides to get a quick control on it, and then for the long-term, utilize the grass carp there. Here's what your application looks like. Very, very simple. And so I didn't want the term of an application to intimidate you none at all. And so here's what the application looks like. As you can see there on your screen, extremely simple, 2 pages, name, address, where you're going to be keeping them at, and then how many you're going to need. And so pretty simple to fill that out. And then you'll send it down there on the bottom of the second form. You'll send it into the permit coordinator down at Austin with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. So if we're going to go the biological control route and utilize triploid grass carp, we want to make sure that we have the food source that they desire. If we don't, again, they're not going to be effective for us. So their first food choice items that they're going to have is hydrilla, bushy pondweed, and submerged plants that we have. If you don't know what those are, it's okay. I'm going to show you photos of all of those as we go through the presentation here. But just keep it in mind right now, if you're wanting to utilize grass carp, hydrilla, bushy pondweed, and our submerged plants. Then our second food choice items, you heard me mention filamentous algae, some of the water lilies that we have, and then water primrose. And I'll show you again what those look like. So just keep those in mind, keep them bookmarked as we go through the program to see if you might have those if you're going or wanting to go with the triploid grass carp. As far as stocking these, when is the best time to put them in? Well, before the growth takes place. You want to have them in there, that way they can get a handle on it before things get bad. Or, as you heard me mention, what some people will do is, if they're going to go the biological control route, they'll first go with the chemical approach to really get a handle on those weeds, and then they'll kind of clean it up a little bit and then allow the grass carp to basically manage it. Winter or spring, that's usually the best time to get it stocked, because that's typically the time whenever we're not dealing with our aquatic weeds out there. So we're getting them in there before we have issues with it. As far as how many do we need to stock? So you want to do 5 triploid grass carp per acre if your aquatic weed coverage is less than 50%. If it's greater than 50%, 10 per acre. And then you can see the range there. The recommendation from Texas Parks and Wildlife is 7 to 15 per acre. And then considerations for restocking every 5 to 7 years. So whenever you're looking at how many do I put in there, some considerations to take in place. We might have an acre pond, but is it a shallow pond or is it deep? That's one thing to keep in mind. We've talked about those shallow areas, but sometimes the whole pond may be a shallow pond. So definitely explore that. If you don't know the depth of your pond, maybe consider getting out there with some type of kayak or a John boat or something like that to be able to stick a stick down in there, or a measuring stick or something, to be able to determine the depth of your water. Length of the growing season, how long are we dealing with these aquatic weeds? And then again, probably one of the should be listed as number 1 is the plant species. If we don't have the types of food that these grass carp are going to want, it's going to be pointless putting them in there. Cost of them, you probably saw this on the form over there a while ago, $16 permit fee, $2 a fish, plus the cost of the fish from the fish farm. You want to allow a little bit of time to allow for the processing to be able to obtain that permit. Usually takes about 4 weeks to get that done. And then if you need, if this is a route that you're wanting to explore, or if this is something that you're wanting to do, feel free to get in contact with us, and we can get you some numbers of opportunities to be able to purchase these triploid grass carp. All right, moving into the next option that you have as far as control is mechanical harvesters. I would say in my experience with working with clientele, I would say probably the number 1 most sought after approach is probably going to be the chemical approach, just because it's fast and usually effective as long as we're applying the proper aquatic herbicide and we've identified those weeds properly. The situations when we get into, well, it doesn't work, or if you hear from your friends, well, this particular herbicide didn't work on my aquatic weeds, it may be because we didn't have those pond weeds identified correctly. The second preferred choice is probably going to be the triploid grass carp, and then the third is the mechanical harvesters. But here's what one looks like. Excuse me, I'll make sure you get to see that there. But a mechanical harvester, that's what it'll look like. And then probably the last option is going to be the seining, pond seining. This is actually going around the edge of the pond and actually physically pulling these out of here with the seine. So a little bit more labor intensive whenever we get into the mechanical harvesters or the seining. One thing that also helps with controlling our pond weeds. Obviously, this is a water feature, but it's an aerator that's in this pond. If we can keep that water churning and keep that water moving, that can help reduce the amount of aquatic weed pressure that we can get in a pond. So definitely an option that we have. Cost-wise, probably going to be a little bit pricey to get this done. But an aerator is definitely something good to have in a pond, especially in our area where we're located at. And I realize that cost may probably stop most of us from being able to put in an aerator. But if it's not an issue, whenever we get into July, August, September, you heard me talk about the oxygen depletion a while ago. If we can keep that water churning, if we can keep that water moving, and it not get in a stagnant state, we're going to prevent that oxygen depletion. Easiest way to do that is with aeration in a pond. And then the cheap method. This picture I've used for several years now, but we can get out there and we can actually pull these pond weeds. It's probably not fun, but it is a way to go about it, and it does work. The one thing about this, you can see the large rake there on the left-hand side of the screen. If we can get at these pond weeds early, if we have the submerged pond weeds, or if we have the thick pond scum, or which would be our filamentous algae, like the picture on the right-hand side of the screen, if we can get at them early, we can usually get control of them here with this self labor method right here. I guess you could say it'd probably be the easiest way to describe this, but definitely a way to control our pond weed. And then finally, our chemical control, and this is the portion of the program in which we're going to get in to showing you exactly how to identify these pond weeds. We're going to go through all of them in this portion of the program. So if you were hoping to be able to get to see what some of these pond weeds look like, this is the point of the program you're going to get to see right here. So when you're selecting a herbicide, you want to ask yourself, first and foremost, and again, I told you at the first of the program we were going to stress this quite a bit, but what's my label? What's labeled to control my targeted species of pondweed that I have? Are there any water restrictions that are involved with utilizing this herbicide? So one thing you may look at right there is a re-entry period, or if you're needing to harvest fish out of there, is there anything that prevents you or prohibits you from being able to harvest fish within a specific time frame after that herbicide application? Big one right here, number 3, is there availability of the product locally, and can I purchase it locally? This is one when we get into some of these pond weeds or aquatic herbicides, some of them can get fairly pricey. And so from a standpoint of retail at some of our local ag product stores, cost is a consideration of having these stocked on the shelves. However, we do have some options whenever we do go into shop locally. A lot of times we may have to order some of these aquatic herbicides. I've dealt with some people here recently that have had to order some just because of the specific aquatic herbicide that they wanted to apply. And then how much is it going to cost me? Some of them are fairly inexpensive as far as what you want to apply. A lot of them are pretty expensive. And so I'll show you some links here in a little bit that you'll be able to click on, and it'll direct you to the label, and then you can go from the label to the to where to purchase them from, and you can see what the cost may be. Let's see if we get this. There we go. All right. So whenever we look at identifying aquatic plants, we break them down into 4 different types. Number 1 is going to be algae. Number 2 is floating plants. Number 3, submerged plants. And number 4, emergent plants. We break them down into those 4 types of aquatic plants. That's the 4 different categories. So the first one, algae. Our 2 main types that we see here in our area are going to be the planktonic algae and the filamentous algae. Usually whenever people call me and they say, I've got pond weeds I need to get identified, if they describe it as pond scum or moss, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be the filamentous algae. And that's our typical description that we find with the filamentous algae is pond scum. And that'll be the picture on the right-hand side of your screen. The picture there on the left-hand side that has the text box over the top of it, that's going to be your planktonic algae. Planktonic algae is probably more so described as a film that's floating across the pond. It can vary in colors. We've seen it green. We've seen it blue. We've seen it neon green, dark green, yellow. In some cases, we've even seen it as red or brown. And so that'll be your planktonic algae is the film or fog that you'll see floating across the pond. When we get into the control, there's a few different options that we have right here. And I'm going to talk about these different options and kind of how they work too, in the different types of pond weeds that we have, from the algae to the submerged to the emerged plants that we'll see. So probably your easiest to find aquatic herbicide for algae is going to be copper sulfate. That's one that when you walk into any ag product store here in Fannin County, you're going to be able to find copper sulfate for the most part. Copper sulfate is going to be it's the blue stones. Sometimes it's actually called blue stone. It's probably one of the most commonly used algae treatments that we have because of the cost. And that's something that, again, we want to make sure we want to get the proper identification, because a lot of times I'll hear from people after the fact, they'll go in, they'll buy the copper sulfate thinking to control pond weeds, and copper sulfate may not control the one that they have. But whenever you go in, it's going to be the cheapest on the shelves that you'll see. It comes in several different forms depending on how finely it's ground. Then we get into the next bullet point there. You've got Cutrine Plus, KT, Captain, and Cleargate. What these are is they are going to be chelated or compound copper herbicides. And so on those right there, sometimes you'll be able to find them whenever you go to the ag product stores. Sometimes we'll have to purchase these. One thing you want to keep a watch on is your copper compounds can be toxic to fish if used above the labeled rates, and can be toxic to soft and acidic waters even below the labeled rates. So I just want to stress this while we're right here on this subject. But if you see a labeled rate there, it's there for a reason. And again, I know I'm probably preaching to the choir right here, but we can't stress the label enough, because the label's a law. But just because it has a maximum rate right there, if you try to go above that, that's going against the law. But as you can see, in some cases, we can get into some toxicity levels. So that's one thing to keep in mind. However, the copper compounds that we have listed here are definitely effective on the algae that we have. Green Clean Pack 27, phycomycin, those are going to be sodium carbonate forms. They're pelleted contact herbicides. So how a contact herbicide will work, and we'll talk about several of those as we go through here, is their kill on contact is what they do. Rather than a systemic actually working through the plant, contact herbicide is going to act when it hits the plant. May take a couple of days to actually kill it, but it's a contact herbicide and will begin work instantly. Clipper is a flumoxacin product in a water dispersal granular. You can mix it with water and then spray it or inject it. The one thing you want to watch out for with Clipper is you want to have a water pH below 8.5 or it won't work. So how do you find out the water pH? Well, that's done through a water test. You can obtain the form for the water test at our soil testing website. It's soiltesting.tamu.edu. If you'll click on the submittal forms on there, then you're going to be able to go down and find the water submittal form, and then you can send in a water test and find out the pH. This next one, chara or muskgrass, the one thing about it is just looking at it from a distance, we have to be real careful on the identification of this one. Looking at it from a distance, it can look like bushy pondweed. You'll see what bushy pondweed looks like here in a little bit. But chara is actually a form of algae rather than an actual submerged weed that we would have in our ponds. But again, from a distance, looks exactly like bushy pondweed. When we get into the control options here, we've got Q-Trine Plus, KT, Captain, and Cleargate. Again, those are the chelated or the compound copper herbicides. Again, don't feel like you have to write all this down. All you've got to do is send me an email. We'll show that at the end of the presentation, and I can email this slideshow over to you. Euglena. This is one that I got to be honest, I didn't identify this until about, I think it was 2, maybe 3 years ago. I hadn't seen this one before. But it's one that we're seeing more often now here in the county, here in the North Texas area. This one, as you can see, this one will scare a person quite a bit. You go out there, and if you have a bloom of this Euglena, and it'll look, the cases that I have seen in person look identical to the picture that you're seeing right here. I mean, it's just a solid film of red all the way across the pond, so it can look pretty scary. Again, it is a form of algae that we have. It's classified as an algae, I should say, and so the aquatic herbicides that we've mentioned before in previous slides are also going to work on this: copper sulfate, Q-Trine Plus, KT, Captain, and Cleargate. Now we're getting into our floating plants. One thing to definitely keep in mind here is that whenever we're identifying, if you look on the picture on the left, which is going to be the duckweed, and if you were to blow this picture up into a closer view and look at this duckweed up close, it's going to look very much like the watermeal in the picture on the right. However, the duckweed is going to be about 4 to 5 times the size of that watermeal right there in individual plant specimens there. But once you go back and in your memory think of those pictures that I showed you of the algae on a pond, from a distance, they look identical, don't they? From a control standpoint, it's going to be a little bit different. Again, I can't stress it enough, and I'm sorry for bringing it up over and over and over, but it's something that we must stress anytime we're talking about aquatic weeds and their control. Is proper identification is key. So as you can see, completely different list of herbicides for the duckweed and the watermeal than what we had on our algae. Reward is going to be a liquid diquat formulation. So one thing about what that means right there, liquid diquat formulation, is diquat is a contact algicide and herbicide. You're going to see Reward pop up many different times when we go through the program here. Reward, Harvester, Tribune, Tsunami DQ, diquat SPC2L, and Weed Trine. Those are going to be our list of 6 liquid diquat formulations that we have. And again, they're a contact algicide that we see, effective on duckweeds and watermeal, also effective on some other aquatic weeds that you'll see as we go through here. Fluoride compounds in liquid or granular forms that we have are going to include Sonar, Avast, and Whitecap. This next one, Habitat, it's only effective on duckweed. It's a systemic herbicide. So how a systemic herbicide works, unlike a contact herbicide or contact algicide, systemic's going to actually work through that plant and get control of it throughout. And then you have the clipper. We mentioned that one on a slide or two ago. The water pH needs to be below 8.5. And again, if you just joined us, how to find out that water pH is through a water test done through our soil and water testing lab. So that got us through the algae and the floating plants. Now moving to the submerged plants. And this is going to be our plants that are going to be below the water surface. Those that don't actually come up out of the water, these are going to be the ones that are underneath. So it makes me want to bring up a point right now. You know, if you go back to the presentation, you heard me talk about phytoplankton being a good thing in ponds. Much food source for our smaller fish, some other things that we have in the ponds, a food source for. Whenever we get into talking about these submerged plants, habitat area is one thing that we must discuss in this situation. From a standpoint of spawning, from a standpoint of habitat or hiding areas for our bait fish, for spawning purposes. So sometimes submerged plants, if they're not excessive throughout the pond, sometimes they can be a good thing. Now, I know I'll be the first to admit that sometimes these can be the most aggravating. Submerged and emerged plants can be the most aggravating from a recreational standpoint. Whenever we get into talking about catching our fish, and again, if you think about where these aquatic weeds first develop, it's in those shallow areas. Well, you think of catching a fish, if you catch him in those shallow areas during our spawning periods, you know, that's a lot of times when we catch those fish up close there to the shallow bank, fish can be lost in these submerged plants or plants that are emerged. Or if you catch a fish out in the middle of a pond, then you've got to drag him through all of this to get him to the bank. Again, could cause you to lose some of those fish. It always seems to happen when you have the biggest one hooked as well. And so I'll be the first to admit sometimes these can be the most aggravating. However, from a habitat standpoint, they can be beneficial to an extent. So let's go through and identify some of these so you can know what you're dealing with. And again, in this presentation, what I've done, there's hundreds of aquatic weeds. And again, that website, aquaplant.tamu.edu, can be very helpful for you in identifying your pond weeds. I'll be happy to help you. All you got to do is email me some pictures. But what I've done through this presentation is I've gone through and put in this presentation the ones that are most common for Fannin County, for our North Texas area. If you may be from another county listening to us, these are going to be the weeds that we see most prevalent in North Texas. American pondweed. When this one's described, whenever I receive a phone call from somebody, this one's described as I have what looks to be leaves floating across the top of my pond. And as you can see from the picture right there, that's exactly what it looks like. It looks like leaves just right there on that surface there of your pond. Excuse me for just a second here. Let's get something pulled up. So we're going to go through the aquatic herbicides that we have available here for control on American pondweed. A lot of these are probably going to come up over and over. So some of this as we go through here might be a little bit redundant as we go through identifying some of these. But again, if you need this slide presentation, feel free to send me an email and we'll get it to you. Reward Harvester, Tribune, Tsunami DQ, Duckweed SPC, 2L, Weed Trine. Those are going to be the liquid Duckweed formulations that I mentioned. Remember, those are going to be our contact algicides and herbicides, which brings up a point that we must address right now. A lot of times, you may have several pond weeds out there. Some cases, you may have one that trumps all the others. It's a lot worse, but sometimes you may be trying to fight several pond weeds at one particular time. So that's when we get into looking at what herbicides will control the most pond weeds that we may have. That way, we're not having to buy this aquatic herbicide for this plant, this aquatic herbicide for this plant. And you're going to see some of these as we go through here. Some of those liquid Duckweed formulations, some of those chelated or copper compounds that you see there on the second bullet, some of those are going to come up quite a bit. So Q-Trine Plus, KT, Captain Cleargate, I'm not going to read down through all of these again. Many of them are going to pop up several times as we go through here. You've heard me mention this one a couple of times throughout the presentation. Now you get to see what it looks like. Bushy pondweed. I would say this one is probably in our top 3 as far as the most questioned when it comes to pond weeds. I would say probably filamentous algae is probably going to be number 1. Bushy pondweed is probably going to be probably number 2 or 3. Water primrose and the American pondweed are going to be a close 3rd and 4th there. But bushy pondweed, as you can see, it gets really, really thick underneath that water surface. This one's a booger to try to drag some fish through. And then once you do get that fish in, you're going to be pulling all of this off of him. Another thing, if you don't catch a fish and you're dragging that lure through, this one's one that every time you drag that lure in, you're probably going to be having to pull the bushy pondweed off of there. Top water's pretty tough to drag across this stuff as well. Management options, you can see we've added a few different ones in there. You can see the comine and the natique copper compound that are registered or labeled for the bushy pondweed. Southern naiad is the technical term for it, but many times we call it bushy pondweed. Coontail, this is another one. Probably from a distance, if you're not up close and you just see submerged plants there beneath the water's surface, coontail and bushy pondweed are going to look similar to each other. But as you can see, the reason it's called coontail is because it actually resembles a raccoon's tail. And so it is still bushy. Another one that whenever we drag a fish through it or if we drag a lure through it, it's going to attach onto that lure or attach onto that fish, and we'll end up having to dig this one off. Again, though, and I know it probably sounds like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth when I say this, but although aggravating, sometimes as long as they're not excessive, can be beneficial to an extent from a wildlife habitat standpoint. Here's your list of control options for the coontail. Now we move into the emergent plants that we have. And again, I've put some of our most common ones that we deal with here in the Fannin County in the North Texas area. These are going to be ones that are along the water's edge. We usually don't see these stretch too far out into the water. Again, eliminating shallow areas probably is most effective when we're dealing with the emergent plants. Also, it works well for submerged plants, but when you think about these emergent plants being right along the water's edge, and as you see right there, coontail being one of the big ones that we deal with, or excuse me, I said coontail, cattail that you see right there in the photo. If we can eliminate that shallow water, less than 2 feet, we can definitely prevent some of the growth with this and the bulrush that you'll see here in a little bit. But a lot of them are going to be growing right along that water's edge. If we don't get control of these, over time, you'll have cattail, you'll have water lily, You'll have water primrose, and I'm mentioning some that we're going to show you photos of. You're going to have bulrush. They will completely surround a water. Cattail, a lot of you probably use it whenever we're dealing with duck blinds. If you from a wildlife habitat standpoint and from a recreational standpoint, if you duck hunt on some of these ponds that we have, cattail can be beneficial from a duck blind standpoint. But again, keep in mind, want to keep it under control for sure. The stems, I don't know how many of you have actually went and tried to pull up cattail or have grabbed hold of the stem. They are tough and really, really stiff. Obviously, they have to support this seed head that we see there on the top, the brown hot dog-like appearance there that we have for the seed head. They've got to support that, so stems are really, really tough. You heard me talk about bulrush. This is, again, one that grows around that water's edge that can completely surround the water. Starts out pretty small. In a lot of cases, we might see bulrush about 2 feet tall around the water's edge, but you can see how tall it will actually get. I've got a close-up here on the left-hand side of the screen of what seed head actually looks like on this bulrush, but you can see this can get up there as tall as cattail if we don't get some control over it. Management options for the bulrush is going to be Rodeo, Aquamaster, Eraser AQ, Touchdown Pro, and Aquatic. You see there the bullet point below, all of these are liquid glyphosate formulation. And so one thing I want to bring out about these liquid glyphosate formulations, whenever you go into some of our local ag product stores that we have here in Fannin County, you may or may not see these 5 that are listed here. However, sometimes you may see what they call aquatic herbicide. I know High Yield has a product that's just called aquatic herbicide. There's some called cattail as a herbicide. If you'll look on those, just make sure that your specific weed is listed on the label. And if it's an aquatic glyphosate formulation, it'll work. And so, again, reading and following the label is really important. And so I just want to bring that out while we're right here in this presentation. You may not exactly see the ones that are listed here, but check the label, check the active ingredient on the label as well. I've got note there, surfactant will want to be used with these liquid glyphosate formulations. And again, that'll tell you that on the label. Here's a close-up of the cattail. We showed you the picture as we moved into the emergent plant section of this. Cattail, there's what it looks like up close. Many of the same types of aquatic herbicides listed there to control. Water primrose, I said this one's probably 3rd or 4th most question that we have through our extension office here in Fannin County. This is the one that's going to get the little yellow flower on the top. And usually when people describe it and they say, I've got a pondweed that has a small yellow flower, it's probably going to be the water primrose. As you can see there in the picture on the left, is we mentioned on all of these emergent plants, they're going to start right there along that water's edge. They're going to develop them a root structure. They're going to anchor, especially this water primrose. It's going to anchor. It's going to spread along your pond and out across your pond. And so one that if we don't get control of, this one right here can completely keep you from fishing. That's how drastic, I guess, that this one can actually spread across the pond. Smaller ponds, it's nothing to see water primrose stretch all the way across the pond if we're dealing with some shallow water across and throughout. Excuse me. Many of the same herbicides listed here. We've added some in from previous slides, but the list there of effective aquatic herbicides that will work on water primrose. White and yellow water lily. Lily pads is what you'll hear this described as in many cases. Again, another one. This is one that we'll see. A shallow pond, it's nothing to see lily pads take over the whole thing. Large ponds, it's nothing to see them. You know, I mean, when I say large, I'm talking, 10 acres plus. We've got a lot of those here in the county. But when water lily comes in and starts trying to take over a pond, when it anchors along that edge of the pond, it's one that can go all the way along the pond's edge. And so one that we want to get control of. And there's your management options when it comes to the water lily. On these management options, all of these can be found on aquaplant.tamu.edu. They are actually hyperlinks whenever you're looking at them on that website. And so as I'd mentioned earlier, you can actually click on these. It'll take you straight to the label, and in some cases will show you where you can order them from. So that's the presentation. Want to finalize or conclude some things here in our summary. And again, I hate to preach again to the choir, but we must stress this over and over and over. But whenever you're applying a herbicide, for that matter, whenever you're applying a pesticide, and pesticide includes herbicides, fungicides, insecticides, rodenticides, anything with the side on it, dealing with pesticides. Whenever we're applying a pesticide, always read and follow the label, because the label is the law. You heard me mention a couple of times about spraying in increments to help reduce oxygen depletion. You're going to find that on the label, just specifically for, or according to the label, that may be specific to specific aquatic herbicides. But make sure you look on that spot and find out if you need to treat a fourth, third, or half of the pond at a time. Again, those are going to be label specific. We said it a few times throughout that some of these weeds can be beneficial from a wildlife habitat standpoint, because that's we sometimes we may not think of fish as wildlife, but they are. They fall into the wildlife management category. So we, from a wildlife habitat standpoint, some of these can be beneficial. And then there's the website that we've referenced throughout this presentation, aquaplant.tamu.edu, a website that I go to every day. We get questions every single day. I can't think of a day this summer that we haven't had pond weeds come up as a question. And so it's a website that I use daily. It's a public. Any of you on here, anybody listening to this, can view this website. Once you get to the home page, you'll just simply click on identify a plant. Then it's going to take you to the next part. It's going to take you to the 4 categories that I've explained to you here: the algae, the floating plants, the submerged plants, and the emerged plants. You'll click on that, and then it'll take you, and you can identify by photos exactly which plant that you may have. Or if you wish, like I said, I'll be happy to help you out if you just want to email me the pictures, and I can do the work for you. From there, once you click on the plant that you actually have, down at the bottom of the screen of your specific plant, it's going to say other photos or how to manage this plant. If you'll click on how to manage this plant, it will take you to the list of aquatic herbicides that we've referenced throughout. And again, those are going to be hyperlinked when you're actually on the website, so you can click on them and find out more information on them. I said I'd provide my email address. There's the email address and my phone number if you'd like to get in touch with me. At this point in time, I'm actually going to stop the recording on here, but we're going to